Welcome to the Assembly of Silence Radio Hour.
And here we are. I'm very pleased to welcome two new guests to the program today. Dan and Andrew, both of them college professors at an undisclosed northeastern institution. Following in the great tradition here at the Assembly of Silence, we don't really identify any of us with our full names or a lot of specific details as to our background or our resume, the various things that might legitimize people and cause one to want to take seriously what people say, because, well, there's an old-fashioned notion that it might be the content of the actual thought that really matters, and not so much the person who says it. So in a society that's dominated by the cults of personality, this seems like a appropriate counterbalance. And it brings to mind, I think in one of the Taoist writings, there's something about how, in a just society, people of no particular account would be listened to by even the people at the highest levels because, well, just because you don't have a high position doesn't mean you don't have something worthwhile to say. And conversely, those in high positions don't necessarily always have the most worthwhile ideas. So, particularly in a time of confusion and crisis, it seems worth approaching things from this more equitable point of view. And if we can't manage to figure out an economically equitable society, something that we're clearly failing at, we might start in that direction with a more intellectually equitable society. And that would mean, on some level, the internet has provided us with this. Everyone has the potential to have a voice here. Of course, whether or not that voice will be heard is the big question. And, typically it pretty much operates the way it always has, with perhaps some exceptions. And, maybe that there have always been some exceptions along the line. It's awfully hard to say what exactly it is that gets people into the public eye. So all this is a long-winded way of saying, here's another episode. And this conversation is the result of a long pre-show discussion that went on for several months. The idea... Dan and I have been friends for a long time. I may as well disclose that. I suppose that's sort of like personal information, but that's about as far as I'm going to go. And Dan suggested that maybe a conversation including Andrew would be something that would be interesting. And so we've been kind of kicking ideas back and forth. We were originally going to discuss disaster capitalism, and it took us a while to kind of get around to it. It's mentioned in this episode, but as usual, in the freewheeling mode that seems to be the Assembly of Silence's modus operandi, things just went where they went. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I certainly did, and I think there's potential for a lot of continued discussion along these lines. It's a bit more pragmatic, I guess you could say, than a lot of the other discussions on this program. A bit less in the spiritual and philosophical domain, and a bit more focused towards politics, which is something that I typically try to avoid. But on some level, it's impossible to avoid politics. Everything is a political statement in the same way that everything is an action, even inaction. We don't necessarily have to see it all as politics, but it does function within the domain of politics because we're a social being, and so every stance that we adopt, every articulation we make, has a political consequence. So we may as well face up to that and just admit that politics are with us in one way or another, and we have to find some way of dealing with them. Okay, I'll try not to say anything more except the standard. If you'd like to support this program, go to the links in the show note description. Also, it would be greatly appreciated if you would share any of the programs that you find to be of value with all of your social media friends and your actual friends too. And you could send it to your enemies also, if you think that perhaps something in one of these programs might convince someone to see things a little differently, and you know someone who you'd really like to see things differently. Drop a little assembly of silence on them. You never know. Hopefully they'll turn it over a few times before they reject it out of hand. Okay, enough said. A conversation between yours truly, Dan and Andrew. Something just came up a moment ago as we were doing the kind of pre-show discussion, which had to do with Andrew's take on the meaning of academic study, I guess you might say, or how you contextualize that. Do you want to kind of weigh in on that and give us a sense of what it is you were saying?
Yeah, that I think when we have a college or a university, for example, we divide it up into these parts and we say, here's a department of X and here's a department of Y and a department of Z. And we act as though, science and the humanities and the social sciences, that all of these are just different things, that they're approaching different parts of the world using different tools, and they shouldn't really talk to each other very much. I find that to be really wrong-headed, because I think that the big questions in life, the things that matter, are things that have to draw on different ways of thinking, have to draw on different traditions, have to draw on different histories, in a sense, and have to look at different things together. And I think that that's the way to actually achieve knowledge, to actually learn things. So in my academic career, I've often found myself bumping up against boundaries of field and discipline. And they say, oh, well, you can't really research that. That's not your field. And I say, well, no one told me that. I think we have to be able to follow the evidence where it takes us and follow our interests where they take us. And I think when you look at people who have in history achieved great things and come up with great ideas or insights, they're people who have not been constrained. They don't say like, oh, well, that's not really what my degree is in, so I'd better just stop thinking about that.
Right. So it seems like that is hearkening back to what might be called a classical conception of philosophy, where the realm of understanding is seen as a whole, and it's really a field that cannot be specialized on some basic level. If you want to have a conceptual grasp in the largest sense, then there's no way to parse it out. But, it's interesting to consider that so many other aspects of human life have been specialized, that in essence, our species has increasingly specialized, particularly since the dawn of the industrial age. In a certain sense, it makes sense that the same thing would happen within the intellectual space, although obviously there are some real downsides to that. You might say that there are some real downsides to specialization in general. I think it's a great idea and something that does seem to be increasingly present with the internet, connecting so many different types of ideas. So it makes sense that things would head in that direction. On the other hand, I think there's sort of a war that's going to happen between what we might say, like there's this institutional inertia where a lot of people are dedicated to specific areas and have kind of carved out their territory, their little fiefdoms, and want to really protect them from any intrusion, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to come down against specialization in such broad terms, but I think historically, when we look at universities, a big part of, as the name implies, it's about the universe, it's about universal knowledge. And the idea was not that any given person could know everything that there was. It's that you have people with different specializations and they talk to each other and they interact with each other. And this sense that if you are the world's leading expert in legal theory, say, I can pick that example because law is one of the oldest academic disciplines, then you might know the most about law, and the person who knows the most about medicine is still someone that you have to consult with when you're making law about medical matters. And then you have someone from, historically, the seminary, say, who could inform you about medical ethics and how you make laws about that. So the specialization is still important, but the specialization and the cooperation have to go together. And as long as you have both of those, if one person is just an expert in, one specific kind of beetle or something, that's totally fine, as long as that expert knows how to talk to people with other expertise.
And it seems that in some respects, that's the issue that has arisen, is that people in different fields really don't know how to talk with each other or have a hard time doing so. And perhaps the communication breakdown is one of the prime features within universities now.
Oh, I would agree with that completely. I think I spend a lot of time talking with people from different fields, and we just talk past each other, and we just talk about different things, and we have a really hard time getting on the same wavelength. With Dan here being an exception, of course.
Yeah, I agree with most of what both of you have said. I agree that there's a ton of value to specialization, but there's also a lot of value to interaction with people in other fields and disciplines, and that in general we probably just don't make the effort to interact with those who speak different languages, figuratively and literally, as much as we should. My sense is academia, there's sort of a trend towards valuing interdisciplinary interaction and that sort of thing more. So in that sense, maybe academia is trending in the right direction and might even take it too far. But there is value, though, to speaking to someone who does share a terminology and jargon and so on. So can understand why people are inclined to do that. And when, in my experience, when I've tried to, I actually, not patting myself on the back or anything like it, but I think I've made maybe more of an effort to interact with people in other disciplines than a lot of academics, and it's been a struggle. So you can understand why people don't do that all that much.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems to me that you've put your finger on one of the primary issues there, Dan, because the language barrier, we might say, is probably not only one of the things that makes it difficult for people to hear what others are saying in their chosen discipline, but it also may at times repel people because the way that language is used can be really radically different in different fields. So we're hearing, right now there's an incredible amount of polarization between some of the gender studies world and people who study evolutionary biology, for instance. And to what extent that comes down to an issue of language, I guess, is itself debatable, but it does seem like that's one of the big triggers when it comes to being able to have a discussion between these groups.
Yeah, because I think we're speaking languages that have, whether it's an academic jargon or something totally different, that's full of sort of markers of our values, markers of our social position and background. And we're trained to hear, I say trained like as human beings, as language users, we're trained to be listening for those in others. So there are so many things that are the jargon of a particular discipline or of a particular in-group of some kind, that if you are not in on it and you don't understand its meaning in a context, it can really easily rub you the wrong way or be confusing. There's a lot of social science jargon that sounds so like cold-blooded from outside of that. And a humanist like me wants to say like, wait, but you're talking about real human beings. And the social scientist says, of course I am. These are just the words that we use for the sake of clarity.
Right.
And that's hard because if you've been trained in that language, that dialect even, then it's easy to lose sight of the fact that not everyone knows it the exact way that you do.
Yeah, communication is just so much harder, I think, than we realize, right? We all know what's we think that we understand our own thoughts and we're expressing them clearly. And usually our own thoughts are more muddled than we realize. And then our expressions of those thoughts are even more muddled, and interpreting these thoughts, that we hear from others is harder than we realize, and so on. So it's hard enough to communicate with someone who is speaking the exact same language. So it's much harder, obviously, when someone has a different interpretation of terminology or different terminology, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. And in some sense, maybe the benefits are potentially even larger when someone's got a whole different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Well, it does seem like certainly the concept of the university in an ideal form is really undermined by the number of different languages that are competing for primacy, I guess you might say. And I can't help but note, one of the things that's often discussed on this podcast are the ways in which what we see happening in the world around us relate to various types of spiritual and intellectual traditions. And so the concept of Babylon is one that jumps to mind in that, the characteristic most associated with Babylon is the confusion of tongues, the inability of the members of that civilization to understand each other. So that seems to be something that really has infiltrated its way out, not just in the university, but really through society at large. And we see people in various professions and various political groups unable to really hear each other.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say when we talk about universities in particular, you use the word competition, which I think is an important one here. And that is because there's some combination of reality and perception to this, but there is the widespread feeling of competition between fields and between disciplines. And sometimes at just this very practical level that you need students and you need dollars, and you need to convince people that your department and that your program and your field of study is worth it. And that's going on constantly, where we have to sit down with students and persuade them to take our classes and not some other departments. But in the broader sense, I think culturally, there are fields that feel that they aren't adequately represented in sort of decision-making, that aren't adequately represented in culture at large. I'm speaking from the humanities here. I'm sick and tired of everybody deferring to scientific experts constantly and never deferring to humanistic experts. That I feel that it's a kind of expertise that's undervalued. And that often then leads to, in myself and in others, either a resentment or an animosity, and just like a sense of antagonism that absolutely doesn't have to be there and shouldn't be there, but it is. And that's a huge barrier to communication, because it also means that there isn't goodwill on all sides very often.
Well, yeah, that kind of starts I'm sorry, Dan, go ahead, please.
Looks like we have, I don't know if I'm hearing me with a lag or what, but sorry about that.
By the way, let me just say, I can edit out a lot of these awkward moments, and I will. So don't worry about that.
No harm done. Okay, good. You're going to have a lot of editing. I don't know how broadly you're referring. Yeah. Anyway, so Andrew, is going to say, so this issue of expertise, certain types of expertise being valued more highly. So I suspect, we could easily go off on, have our discussion go off in this direction, because I would guess this relates to this broader capitalism thing which we had considered being something that we would discuss today. And I suspect that you would attribute the valuation of certain types of expertise to the fact that the market rewards, students perhaps who focus on expertise from certain disciplines and so on. And so I guess that this issue of different types of perspectives and viewpoints on campus being treated differently and treated with different sort of levels of interest and respect and so on is related to the way that those fields are treated by the market, which you also don't think is a great system for determining how disciplines should be evaluated. Is that fair to say? I mean, I don't know if you want to go in that direction now, but it'd be interesting.
Yeah. I haven't thought about that very actively today, but yes, I definitely agree with that as you put it. What strikes me immediately as I start to think about this is that there's a complicated dynamic here between what the market values, financially, what kind of degrees get you jobs, what kind of departments get massive grants, etc., and the sort of cultural prestige, we could say, or sort of philosophical prestige, that if I tell people what field I'm in, they kind of blink at me, and that doesn't happen to someone whose field is something that's, more obvious, I guess. And so there's a sense in which, there's more money in this because there's more interest, but then there's more interest because there's more money. And both of those are because of a particular role that a particular kind of knowledge can serve ideologically. I think that's, to take an extreme example, like in the Soviet Union, there was this deep belief that a lot of disciplines needed to be rendered scientific in a way that they had not been. So you have history becoming a scientific discipline in accordance with a very rigid ideology. And this is then particular kinds of research, particular kinds of claims, particular kinds of ideas are supported, are funded. People are given careers for doing them with a specific ideological function in support of the government, in support of the power structures that exist. I'm deliberately using an example from a country that doesn't exist anymore to be not provocative about it. But that would be an example of how that ideology can determine those sort of values, often with the appearance of neutrality, that someone could say like, oh, well, of course more people want to study this. There are more jobs in it. Well, okay, but why are there more jobs? You could imagine a world where poets make a lot of money and doctors are poor, That could happen. I mean, it's not about to, but you could imagine it. And if you imagine that, suddenly colleges look a lot different.
Yeah, it harkens back to one of the points that's made by Daniel Schmattenberger. In our pre-show discussion, we were talking about disaster capitalism as kind of a focal point for the conversation. And there were a number of offshoots from that, one of which is this discussion by Schmattenberger where he talks about the kind of unbounded rivalrous game and how that has a tendency to create, we might say, incentives in a particular direction that undermine some things that are extremely important, like appreciation of the natural world, perhaps, is undermined by the monetization of everything. So because there can't be a dollar of value assigned to the sound of the songbirds, it's likely that the various things that are necessary in order for the natural system to continue to support the songbird will not be supported in the same way that other ventures will be. So we see a similar thing within the institution, within the university. We have a kind of emphasis based upon a certain unbounded rivalrous game in practice that creates excess value because of the basic mechanism that the society at large is using for assessing value. And other things that, those of us who study them might realize are of the greatest value are shunted aside because they can't be valued in those terms.
Mm-hmm.
It's understandable that every civilization will have its set of values and preferences, and that things will generally be weighted on that basis. So, something's always going to get left out. But of course, whatever it is that a civilization is ignoring and shunting aside, it does so at its own peril.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would caution though, talking this way always makes me a little bit anxious that we run the risk of vastly simplifying what comes under the heading of a civilization or a nation or a culture or something like that. Because it's easy to say like, oh well, these things aren't valued, so they're being cast aside. But they're not being cast aside completely. There are plenty of artists who get funded by the government or by philanthropists or by the market in a few cases, once we're successful. So it's not, I'm hesitant to overstate the case and say there are market forces that provide value to a specific number of, just some limited number of tangible commodities that are for sale, and everything else, the matters of the heart, are completely forgotten. Because that's not true.
Let's drill down on that a little bit, because I wasn't talking about market forces necessarily. It was more a generalized observation on the particular kind of game being played, you might say. So if we have a rivalrous game of any kind, I think probably it is often expressed in economic terms, at least, while there's no extensive shooting going on, it's mainly an economic game. It's the kind of mindset of rivalry, which is something I think you mentioned earlier, that, why can't we have a more cooperative model? Mm-hmm. And, to a large extent, it's because of certain on-the-ground realities that there's a pie of a certain size, and different groups are going to get access to some slice of it based on their ability to compete with others. Clearly, there's an incredible differential disparity between the access to what the pie consists of. So it seems very, we can imagine different ways of things working, but in the particular scenario that we're in, with a very large population and a relatively limited pie, it's hard to imagine how it would work differently. And as to the oversimplification thing, I would just say one quick thing is that, when one isn't an expert on something, it's impossible not to oversimplify any given topic. So I will continually oversimplify things, and I apologize for that. But on the other hand, I also think that it gets incredibly difficult. One of the reasons why there's a lot of confusion and animus between different fields is because the big picture can't be agreed upon, and the complexities of each field in detail are such that it's impossible to unravel things. So trying to find some kind of common framework is always going to be a process of simplification, of oversimplification. But on the other hand, it might, particularly if there can be an agreement to put aside some of the details, it might be one of the only pathways towards bridging some of the distances between different camps. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Let me give you an example then of what I'm thinking of that I think is a really pertinent one here, and then maybe we can we'll go from there. But a lot of people that I talk to say things. I hear a lot very similar to what you just said about this idea of it's competition. Maybe it's not nice, but this is how it is. This is how evolution has brought us. Some people would say like, oh, it's just human nature or something like this. And this is why, for instance, some, starry-eyed left-wing philosophy like socialism is impossible, because that's just not what people are like. And this is a very strong argument. This is a very powerful argument that's been around for a long time. And my response to this is always really straightforward, which is like, okay, well, are you in a family? You don't compete with your own children when you are constantly, raising them and giving up of yourself to do that. That is true for all of us who were not raised in a Romanian orphanage, that we have had a direct and concrete experience of utter selflessness based on love. And that's where we come from. And I don't mean that every family is happy or anything like that. But what I mean is everyone recognizes the harmonious family based on love as a way that human beings can interact. And we can say, we can do that I can willingly give up the last piece of pie to someone in my family every day at dinner, having spent the whole day, being in a bank fighting over the pie with, rival bankers. So what I mean is we can do all of these things at once, that a person can behave in a competitive way much of the time, and in a cooperative way other times, in an utterly selfless way at other times. To talk about human nature as though there's just one way that we always are just doesn't accord with anyone's daily life, I don't think. So it's not that we have to imagine a different way for people to interact with each other. It's that we have to imagine different contexts in which people could act in different ways. So that's the kind of oversimplification that makes me nervous, because it doesn't give human beings enough credit for our complexity, for switching between things. I know, Dan, we've talked about this a little bit. Does that make sense? Can you add something from your research that connects to that?
So I don't know if I'm going to have time to respond properly, but yeah, Andrew, you're not saying anything controversial here at all. I mean, it's worth clarifying that human nature is, sure, it depends on context, but that's not just human nature. Of course, that's
Sure.
The nature of, probably all animals. So that we will fight harder for our kin and give more to our kin, and so on. So I'd be thrilled to keep talking about, to what extent are we cooperative versus competitive? To what extent are we truly altruistic versus selfish, or do we just care about looking altruistic, and how much does that vary? And I think that's a really interesting topic, but I don't know if we want to spend more time on that. But I want to quickly talk about Noah's reference to, the pie being fixed, and note that, of course, sometimes it's a zero-sum game over a fixed pie, and sometimes it's not, right? Sometimes we can grow the pie by being more cooperative or taking certain actions. And I'm not sure if I don't know if I could give you references for this claim I'm about to make, but I suspect that there are some sites out there that would show that in general we have a bias toward thinking that the pie is fixed more than it really is. That more games are not actually zero sum. We tend to think that we're fighting over a fixed pie more than we really are, and there are more gains from cooperation than we realize. So I don't know if Noah would even disagree with that or anything, but because he focused on the zero sum situation, I thought that was worth noting.
I do agree with that. Although I think, to be more accurate about it, we'd have to admit that the Earth does have finite resources, and that while we could certainly find more equitable ways of sharing those resources and probably more efficient ways of utilizing them, there is basically a fundamental net energy ceiling to what we've got going on this planet. There may be some strategies for harvesting energy from elsewhere, but
I have mixed feelings about economic growth. I think that, obviously growth tends to bring about a bunch of new unanticipated problems in terms of environmental issues and so on, and psychological issues even. New forms of consumption can cause all kinds of issues we never would have thought about. But I do think that, resource-wise, energy-wise, in some ways we're not very tightly constrained. I mean, but Andrew, do you want to comment? I don't know if this is something you have much to say about. If not, don't worry about it. But if you have comments on this, I'd be curious to hear.
Yeah. Only a little bit, I think. Yes, it's certainly true that, energy or whatever we can understand as a finite resource. But I think that there are probably more cases than most people think. Dan, I absolutely share your instinct that we have our bias is in favor of seeing more things as zero sum than actually are. And I think there's probably a danger of that fact, which exists, objectively in many different forums, of letting that color our thinking even when it doesn't really apply. So the fact that there aren't enough fossil fuels for us to keep digging them up at the rate we're going, for another 1,000 years or something, doesn't really apply to my personal decision making about energy use, for example. So I think that talking about that very, very zoomed out scale is one of the ways in which we could be feeding that bias towards zero-sum thinking, towards seeing our resources as more limited than they actually are. And when I say that out loud, it makes it sound like I'm advocating more consumption or something, which I'm certainly not. But I think that the theoretical limit, it's also true that the Earth is going to get swallowed by the sun one day, but that's not a reasonable way to be informed that's not a reasonable fact to inform our policy when we talk about sustainability, I think. So there are all of these ways in the short term, by short, I mean like non-cosmic, that are about distributing resources, that are about managing resources, where the ultimate shortness of resources, the ultimate scarcity of resources doesn't really enter the picture. So that's the way I would take it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, it strikes me that while it's easy to talk about resource availability in the abstract, the fact is that many of these resources have been secured and are essentially owned, and that ownership is protected with a great deal of force. So,
yes,
the way in which one might hope to redistribute or modify existing systems seems like, unless you have some kind of greater force, you're going to have to negotiate with those who have secured these resources to the extent that they have, because quite often even they haven't managed to really secure it. They're basically vying with a number of competitors themselves to keep their mitts on whatever it is that they're after. So, it's in some respects, I think conversations about resource, we can speak theoretically, but when it comes to what's actually going on the ground, there's a war going on. And unfortunately, that is a reality that is far more present than even the kind of global limitation of resource or the eventual death of our solar system. You know what I mean? Like there's a limit to what theory can accomplish in the face of the on-the-ground game being played.
Yes, I'll absolutely agree with that. Yeah, I think that puts really nicely sort of what I was trying to get at, that it's not a matter of the absolute number of resources. It's about power and about control of resources. So the issue, if I'm hungry, the issue, it has no bearing whatsoever on my hunger. The fact that the Earth produces, enough food. Last I looked it up, it was like enough to feed 12 billion people, way more than we have. That the surplus of food globally doesn't matter if the food that is available to me is, if there isn't enough available to me, if the people who are producing and selling it are doing so in an exploitative way, in an inefficient way, in an ineffective way, in a cruel way of some sort. So I think these are what we're talking about as resource problems, I think are better understood as power problems than as resource problems.
Yeah, I also think that Schmattenberger's way of describing, I think he calls them multipolar traps, where in essence, all players would stand to benefit if everyone abided by a set of rules of cooperation, you might say.
Yes.
But this breaks down quickly when any individual actor decides to grab something, to break the rule, grab something for themselves and seize an immediate advantage, because it forces all players to do the same.
Yes.
And then you're kind of in a race to the bottom, in essence. Yes. And it seems like this dynamic happens anywhere where agreements break down. And certainly if there's one thing that has characterized recent history, it's the breakdown of agreements, the breakdown of laws, the failure to enforce laws. And And, this kind of polarity that we're seeing, the polarization within a variety of different groups, could also be seen as a byproduct of a lot of unfulfilled contracts, you might say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those scenarios, those race to the bottom scenarios, I thought his description of that was very effective. And Dan, you're definitely more of the expert here, but what I find in his very effective summary, giving arms races as an example, that's all very intuitive. And in part of the Q&A that he was dealing with, he didn't really develop this as much, but he makes it clear, and I think it is clear, that not every game theoretical situation has to be like that. It's about the way incentives are structured. So you can imagine, the idea of someone immediately seizing a short-term advantage. You can imagine scenarios where that doesn't lead to a race to the bottom. For instance, if someone steals something to have the most, but there is an effective, judicial system and that person goes to jail and doesn't get to keep what they stole. In that scenario, you don't have the race to the bottom in the same way. And so the problem, as he sees it, as I think reform capitalists see it, is how to restructure the incentives so that you can create those race to the top situations, so that you can I've always joked that capitalism is like jujitsu economics. It's about trying to take the force of like selfishness and short-sighted thinking and redirect it in a direction that is somehow positive in spite of its best wishes. And that seems to be the reform capitalist dilemma. Dan, does that seem right?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes. When these agreements break down, or if there's a tendency for agreements to break down, it just means that the punishment for deviating from the agreement isn't strong enough, or it's not credible enough, right? So most of the time, it's going to be feasible to come up with some way to structure the agreement so it's sustainable. Certainly, the smaller the community, the more sustainable agreements will be, right? So in a small college, if one department is a bad actor in some sense, it's easy to keep them in line and deter them. But international competitions, literal arms races, that's where it gets a lot trickier. I'm not going to say that every international agreement is something that can be maintained with the right there might be limits to incentives in certain contexts, but in general, I don't think that these sort of repeated rivalrous games are necessarily bound to be races to the bottom, because if we're clever enough, we can come up with ways to sustain cooperation. You just jujitsu. What did you say? Capitalism is jujitsu economics or something like that? Because it's the idea is to somehow redirect our bad impulses towards the common good, and our selfishness and short-sightedness. So I completely agree with selfishness.
And to ultimately choke out the opponent.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. I didn't think the metaphor through all the way to the end.
Yeah, is that what happens in jiu-jitsu? We probably I don't even know enough about jiu-jitsu to know what it means really, but so the short-sightedness thing is different from the selfishness thing, because being selfish doesn't imply being short-sighted at all necessarily, right? If you're selfish, but you also care about your future self, but if you only care about your present self, you'd be short-sighted as well, I guess. But yeah, I'm more optimistic that we can come up with and we have historically. So do all agreements break down? No, but there's lots of examples. Our agreement, Noah, it sounded like you were implying that agreements of different kinds are becoming more likely to be eroded in recent years, and that's an interesting idea. I mean, anecdotally, sure, it seems true, but obviously we're exposed to the sort of horror stories more than we are to the times when it's not news when an agreement continues to be maintained, right? It's news when things fall apart. So I don't know if it's true that we're having more trouble with maintaining.
Yeah, the world is.
Yeah, go ahead.
The world is continually in the process of breaking and making agreements. So, what the overall picture is perhaps, and in some respects, maybe the overall picture isn't the thing to focus on, because it's always the exception that ends up being the seed of something new. So the idea, I think what we agree on is that, yes, we can conceive of a far better way of doing things, and that having proper incentive structure that contains both meaningful carrots and sticks that are actually implemented when the rules are broken, that on some basic level, that is the package that would solve the problem. But again, we're faced with the problem of power, because the present system is something that is enforced by the interests that have aggregated power. Mm-hmm. So the extent to which one would be able to reform in a meaningful way this system would again come down to the same kind of power dynamic. And so the question then becomes, well, where, assuming, which is a big assumption, that we could agree on a particular package of incentives to rebalance the system, how on earth could we get it implemented? And what would be the source of the power that would convince the powers that be to allow such a change to occur?
That's the big question. This segues perfectly to what I was hoping we were going to talk about today with disaster capitalism. We've been floating around those ideas, and I guess sort of piggybacking off of that, I guess here's the thesis I want to throw out today. And I feel so many of these things that we're talking about, and so much of what we were mentioning earlier with some of the campus activism that I've been involved with and things like that, all of this feels very, very urgent right now, because there's one thing that I've learned from studying history, and that's that when you have certain kinds of crises that look a lot like the one we're in now, between the pandemic itself as a public health crisis and the economic crisis that's following off of that, crises like these always remake the social structure into which they come in some way or another. What's going to happen when this economic crisis is over, when this pandemic is in the history books, things are going to look different in some way. And in particular, there's going to be a different arrangement of power structures. And the question of what that new arrangement is going to be is, as of today, June 28th, 2020, wide open. And that's why I feel this great sense of urgency in talking about these questions, because there have been crises like this, or on a bigger scale, that have turned out to be tremendous opportunities that have made the world much, much better in their wake when power has been effectively rearranged. There are also crises that have been disasters, where the crisis itself became an opportunity for opportunistic, sort of like an opportunistic social infection to sneak in and to make things much worse in the form of a power grab of some sort. So we can look at, I think, for example, in the wake of World War I, a whole bunch of countries in Europe became democratic republics for the first time. We had genuine democracy throughout the continent of Europe for the first time in history, because there was a crisis that called into question all of the old regimes. But then on the other hand, we look at more recent examples like, September 11th in the United States was not an occasion to scale down US imperialism. It wasn't a lesson in hubris or anything like that. It was an opportunity for an expanding surveillance state, for further military engagement, for the further sort of metastasizing of the military-industrial complex into everyday life in the United States in ways that, kids today don't even remember a world that wasn't a surveillance society like that. So those would just be two examples that go in opposite directions. Right. And what the 2020 coronavirus pandemic is going to be, I have no idea. But I think we need to admit the possibility that things could get a lot better in the wake of this, and try to imagine, not all at once necessarily, but step by step, how we could try to make that happen. That's my challenge for myself and for everyone right now. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah. So, interesting times. That's the cliche of the moment, right? And what's going to happen next? And how are there going to be truly major changes, or are there going to be superficial changes with corporations now paying greater lip service to certain issues? It's, I think it's, we could go either way. 1968, there was a lot going on, and yet, and there were some significant changes that occurred during that period that did last, and yet there wasn't an actual, revolution, and for better or for worse, right? The system ultimately sort of reverted back to sort of stability, pretty quickly. And of course, there were other issues that came up in the 70s and so on, but things calmed down, I guess. But so the 9/11 thing, though, just made me just think of a question that I'd be curious to get your thoughts on. So you said 9/11, instead of just it didn't cause the U.S. to become less imperialistic. If anything, we became more, the surveillance state grew and so on. So did bin Laden make a strategic mistake? Do you think if the goal was to actually get the U.S. out of the Middle East and so on, would that have been more likely with a different administration? So I know there are plenty of cynical people who think that the answer is obviously no, but that the Dems and Rs are two sides of the same coin, or whatever. But I don't think the Iraq War would have happened with another administration. And so, was bin Laden strategically short-sighted by doing 9/11 during an administration that essentially his goals caused the ultimate, it was successful in the sense of terrorizing us, but it wasn't successful in the long run in terms of deterring the U.S. from intervening in the Middle East. So I wonder if I don't know, that's probably too much of a tangent to worry about too much. But I just thinking about the strategy, the timing of bin Laden's decision to make the attack then. But what's going on in the world? Yeah. But just really quickly to wrap up, 2020. How much are and Noah's question of like, how do we get the powers that be to actually make real changes? That's like, the 64. That's the big question. And maybe I'll share some more thoughts on that in a sec. But if anyone wanted to respond to any of the sort of stream of comments that I just spewed out, feel free. Yeah.
Well, yeah, let me take a crack at a few things here. Since you brought up the bin Laden thing, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. And of course, my sense is that when it comes to these types of things, we just don't really know. We don't really know exactly what happened, and we don't really know what motivates the various players. We don't really know what the alliances of the various players are either. But I think you could say that perhaps on some level, bin Laden was less interested in getting the U.S. out of the Middle East as he was in bringing the empire down. So you could say that he would know, perhaps, that there would be retaliation, and that would get the United States involved in a quagmire that would, in the same way that, because basically, bin Laden came out of the whole, the Afghan war with the Soviet Union, right? So the Mujahideen, in essence, played a role, let's say, in bringing down the Soviet Union. I mean, a lot of people would probably point to the fact that they were pretty well collapsing in and of themselves. And so you might make the same case with the United States. If indeed it does collapse, it sure looks like we're not doing too well right now. And it didn't help that we ended up spending all of our national treasure on these horrifying and immoral military actions in Iraq and Afghanistan and frickin' Syria, Libya, you name it, right? It's a disaster of unbelievable proportions. And to a large extent, none of that could have happened without 9/11, right? So you could make the argument that actually, if bin Laden's intention was to undermine the future of the United States, that he's done a pretty good job. Do you guys want to address any of that before we move on? There's a couple of other things I'd like to talk about.
I want to resist the temptation to speculate about Osama bin Laden's motives.
Yeah, I think that's probably wise. Dan and I just went down that rabbit hole. Damn it, Dan.
Yeah, my fault.
Yeah, it's all Dan's fault. But let's move on. What's next?
Well, I think that what we're really getting to here is the question of, where is the power? And, if you're talking about historically something like World War I that Andrew was mentioning earlier, we were really in the nation state era, and there was a battle over political power. So I think there's a presumption that similar things are happening now, and I really don't know that that's the case. My sense is that power has shifted quite a lot since the rise of the corporate state, and that corporations, multinational corporations, have far more sway over political entities than nation states have over corporations. That seems just obvious on the face of it, but I would say that we're probably even dealing with something entirely different right now. I think that we've gotten to the point where the actual power is in the hands of the information gatherers, and that it's a very specific set of corporations who have aggregated an incredible amount of information about everyone else. And those are the real power players now, is my sense of it. So I think that whatever movement it is that one would hope to see brought to fruition, it would have to comport with whatever it is that's going on in the information space, and what's going on in the information space is a huge question in and of itself, because I'm not entirely convinced that it's necessarily human agency that's making the primary decisions within these organizations. Right now, the degree, when you have information aggregation on the level that's presently going on, there's no human capable of making informed decisions with this amount of information. And so necessarily, we are starting to see artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is already making the decision as to what each of us sees in our social media feed. And I heard it, I think it was one of the interviews that I sent to you guys. One of them noted, I think it was Joshua Bach, said that the power of the artificial intelligence that's controlling the feed, that decides what it is that you're going to see on Facebook or Twitter or what have you, is far more than the power of Deep Blue that beat Garry Kasparov in chess. So in essence, we're playing a game with something that's far more powerful than the AI that beat the greatest living chess player in the world. So what does that tell us about our position here?
Yeah, I liked that comparison. I'm thinking about a wonderful book. I'll send you the information for it. It's a book called What Algorithms Want by Ed Finn. It's a really good book about...
That's a great title.
Yeah, sort of about the philosophy of how we understand algorithms. And one of its many takeaways is how, and this has been reported on in the news as well, with a lot of sort of consumer goods, but the way algorithms or AIs that are programmed algorithmically reflect, reproduce, and then strengthen the biases of the programmers. This comes up in like silly ways that are easy to point to. The fact that it's only men who ever programmed, the Siri and those sort of things. So when you ask them like where to buy a tampon, they have no idea. Like they've never heard that word because it was only men who don't know what that is. So silly things like that. But at a deeper level, this sense of what kind of information is prioritized, what kind of information enters the self-learning loops of the algorithm. Those sort of things are invisible biases of their programmers, or visible biases, as the case may be. So the way the analogy would be like, if you have a baseball bat, you can swing it and generate way, way more force than your arm, but it's still moving in the same direction in a way that's determined by the movement of your shoulder. So it's bigger, but it's only an extension of what you've done in the first place. So there may not be human agency at the direct conscious level of every decision. And of course there isn't, but there is human agency in the programming, in the in the design at the most basic level. So we can point to that, I think. So there are people and there are particular incentive structures, the great example about, advertisement algorithms or like YouTube algorithms that put you to more and more shocking and radical content. That's a design decision that is made by a person that is implemented then by the AI. So I think we shouldn't let the programmers off so easily.
Well, it's interesting because the example that you use, I'll just be real quick, Dan, is pretty fascinating in the context of the information space, because there's no way, if you're swinging a bat, for the ball to readjust the general thrust of the batter. But in this case, like, everyone can notice that Siri doesn't understand tampon. And so it's easy enough for that feedback to enter the code, in essence, right? So on that level, it's a more flexible medium. And while there certainly are predispositions and biases and prejudices within the coding community, it's also the case that a lot of what they're doing right now is figuring out ways to get the machine to configure itself, which is a whole set of other issues. But to some extent, I would imagine that some of what's going to end up happening is that the machine is going to make decisions that the coders wouldn't want it to make. And maybe the coders will change that. They may try to gain control over that at some point or another, but that'll be a different kind of battle that's going on. And I imagine it may already be going on. In some sense, you do see that happening because YouTube and Facebook, their algorithms produce certain results and it gets the company into trouble. And then they basically have to override those results manually, or then they go tinkering with the code to try and get the algorithm to do something a little bit differently, right? Mm-hmm. So it's going to be
that's a good example.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that example because what it points to is what I, like, in my eternal optimism, want to believe. So if, a Google algorithm, whatever, comes up with a whole bunch of super racist results, if we are still in a position where there is public outcry, people pulling advertisements or whatever, and Google says, sorry, we're going to change the algorithm, then that's a sign that there is still democratic accountability to these corporations and to the power holders, whether they're elected officials or whether they're the corporate power holders who are closely allied with them. So this, I think, is an example that tells us that it's not over. All of these cataclysmic scenarios of corporate dystopias or something, they're not here yet. We still have our foot in we as the people still have our foot in the door with Google and still have some degree of power. The power is not completely in the hands of corporate interests or of the information gatherers, as you put it. So this is an optimistic note I want to throw in.
I love it when you're optimistic.
Yeah. We should take every optimism, every little shred of optimism that we can. I think it's a great value. But I also Dan knows, and I think I recently responded to one of his tweets about personal bias. He had, I think, tagged me as having a negativity bias, which I'll accept, but I think I would think of it as more of a reality bias. So then the question that I would bring up with respect to this particular issue...
You're not accepting it's a bias.
Pardon? What was that?
If you think it's a reality bias, then we're defining. This gets back to the language issue, I guess, but we're defining bias differently.
Right.
It's being realistic, I would say.
Exactly. So
acknowledging that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to. Of course, if we're really going to drill into that, then those are some pretty elemental terms to try to.
If we're running out of time.
We are 6 minutes and 11 seconds. So then the question I would just bring up is, to what extent is the power of the people going to merely be able to get Siri to understand the word tampon versus actually produce real tangible changes that improve people's lives. You know what I mean? So yeah, maybe we can get algorithms to get tweaked and what have you, but are we going to be able to get food on the table for the hungry? Are we going to get homeless people in shelters and not just in shitty shelters? You know, are we going to be able to improve the general well-being of the populace? Or are we going to just kind of have little concessions that are essentially like, you know, Siri being able to identify something that was previously unidentified?
So can I quickly comment here? Wow.
Yeah.
When I hear the echo, my voice is even worse. So I'd be curious, Andrew, to hear your take, to hear your reaction. I don't know if you have, earlier you were talking about these being like momentous times and crises presenting opportunity. I'm not sure if you have specific sort of thoughts on how we should take advantage of potential opportunities now. But in terms of the information, those who have information having power, because they're using computing resources that can beat us at chess. I'm personally, I don't know, I still get a lot of targeted ads that try to sell me things that I just bought already, therefore I don't need them again, or they're based on a random Google search. And, I'm not too impressed by the AI there. I guess I would also note that, we have Noah, you referred to corporations having more power than governments and so on, but corporations compete with one another. And, earlier we were sort of expressing our concerns about the fact that entities that are ostensibly in competition could be better off if they maintain long-term agreements to cooperate. But so to the extent that it's impossible to cooperate in the long term, that's going to cause corporations to fail to cooperate as well. So if we, maybe they'll do a better job of cooperating than other entities, but maybe not. So it's hard to get disparate groups of whatever that are competing at some level to maintain cooperation. So that's good news in the sense that it's going to make it less likely for big corporations to sustain collusion. And I have to note, since we were talking about academia earlier, Andrew and I, the big question in academia recently has been, what are colleges going to do this fall, right? Are they going to open up, and to what extent are they going to open up, bring students back? And I kind of thought that there was going to be a lot more cooperation and collusion across colleges than there was. It seems like everyone's coming up with their own policy, and there's not that much standardization across colleges. So I'm surprised by the lack of consistency and cooperation there. But that does, the good news is it means that these powerful organizations are not conspiring to decide everything in a sort of shadowy way. And I think that probably applies to corporations as well. But how do we get the power to the people? God only knows. I mean, my basic take would be get rid of political parties, and maybe pick random people to be our representatives and leaders.
Yeah, I've heard people talk about that, and I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. Andrew, do you want to address what Dan just put forth?
Yeah, I think so Dan was saying that there was no shadowy conspiracy between corporate interests that is secretly running the show, and I think that's true. I think there is not, a headquarters underneath the Denver International Airport where the heads of all the big companies, meet with the Masons and everything. But I think one of the important ways of understanding, what's the right way to put this? I think it is not necessary to have a shadowy conspiracy to have a sort of indirect kind of cooperation. And I think that the key to understanding that is the difference between competition and a genuine conflict of interests. If you and I are playing basketball, we're competing with each other, but we have the same interests in that we both want the ball to not pop, we both want the hoop to be there, and we both want there to be nice weather for playing basketball if we're outside. So we're competing, but within a context where our interests are generally aligned. And in an effective market system, you have, the CEO of Starbucks and the CEO of McDonald's are like I guess they're competing with each other over the coffee customers, but they have the same basic interests in terms of how they want the market regulated or not, in terms of how much they want people drinking coffee, in terms of how much, whatever kind of policies you want, trade policies that they want to help import coffee beans, things like that. So they don't have to be secretly in an anti-market sort of way colluding to just recognize that they have a lot of interests in common. And so what you see is not shadowy at all. It's completely right in the open. You see massive, massive contributions to campaigns. You see huge amounts of money flowing into the political system from corporate interests. And then you see that money flowing right back out. The CARES Act is a perfect example of this. Something like $20 billion at least went for fossil fuel subsidies in that act. 539 million went to airline industry bailouts from, arranged by congressmen who had been bought, or who had not been bought, let's put it a little less cynically, who had had their campaigns in part funded by those same interests. So this isn't shadowy at all. This is just right in the open, and that's what a corruption of democracy looks like. So I don't think you have to be a conspiracy theorist to see it right there. And that's where I think something like the shock doctrine becomes a really powerful understanding of disaster capitalism, that what's happening is things are broken, everyone is distracted, and so the rich and powerful have just made a massive cash grab, and they want to make more. And that's the danger of what's going on now, and what will continue going on if we don't stop it.
Well, it seems like this is another manifestation of Schmattenberger's multipolar traps model. You could say that the game, like basketball, can proceed as that game for so long as everyone is abiding by, the same basic set of rules. But as soon as one team, makes the hoop that they have to get it into bigger, or says, we're not going to dribble, then you end up in the same kind of combative situation and race to the bottom. And I think Dan's point was that, tell me if I got this right, Dan, that dynamic is at play within the corporate sphere just as it is anywhere else. And so there are some, you could say, limits on the degree to which collusion will happen in a world that's operating on that unbounded rivalrous game type of model. Was I understanding that correctly, Dan?
Yeah. That's that. Yeah, you said it very well. And to get back to Andrew's response, I pretty much agree with all of that. I would just note that some of the interests that the corporations share are interests that the general population shares, right? So both McDonald's and Starbucks do better when consumers have more resources, when they have more money to spend, when they have greater demand. So not all of the shared interests are in opposition with the interests of the general public. But I completely agree that there's potential for disaster after disasters, and it does seem like there's a lot of evidence that policy responses to what's going on now have been, basically corrupt, or maybe just explicitly corrupt. And, the fact that airlines were flying, I think there are rumors that there were a lot of planes flying around completely empty because they're required to do that to get their bailouts. And it was just sounds, just completely outrageous. But this is all political, this is a problem with politics, maybe more than capitalism per se. Right.
Yes. So I
don't know what to do. Yeah.
Another way of saying that I think is just to kind of tie it a little bit is in a system of perverse incentives where you have, like what you were just saying, ridiculous carrots, where you have to fly planes in order to get credits or what have you, and ineffective sticks where the laws just aren't being enforced properly. Well, then, yes, you're going to have a situation whenever a disaster occurs, you're going to have opportunists who find ways of capitalizing on it because there's no consequence for them doing it. They can get away with it, right? I think that what we're really, we're kind of navigating this similar territory now for a while. And my sense is that we're zeroing in on is the question of if we can envision, not even getting to the point where we have envisioned a particular model, but let's say we are able to envision a better model. How do we get it installed when the system has already deteriorated to the extent that it has? Like, how do you reform a system that has lost its ability to enforce incentives? Is that, now that's an oversimplification because it's not across the board, right? But that's kind of just the overall gist of what I hear us circling around.
Yeah, and I would say that's I would change that slightly. I don't think that the system, if we say our democratic structures, they have not lost the ability to set the right incentives. They have lost the will to do so. They have, in a calculated, systematic way that is not a secret because they will say this out loud. They have decided not to pursue meaningful oversight of the private sector. They have decided to undermine on purpose public infrastructure and to erode faith in public institutions. That is the strategy of the Republican Party in this country. And I'm not saying this in a partisan way, but they're the ones who put it in exactly these terms. It's not a secret. Their plan, what they did after Katrina, they said, our plan is to make the public schools so bad that the privatization schemes we want to do look good by comparison. That this is the strategy. And what we can do about it, all of the structures are there. They just need to be manned by people who want to do it. The will has to be there to use the power that exists. So what we've had, for example, right now, we have a Congress that has a limited interest in exercising oversight over a corrupt president. There's some, but there's not enough. And that is directly the result of what voters are asking for. And if voters ask for it, we can do it. And that's why we have a better Congress now than we did last time, why we have more calls for oversight, more concrete proposals for ways to make these markets work with incentives that work in the right direction. I mean, this is everything in that whole talk that Schlachtenberger gave was just him trying, it's like he was allergic to the words public sphere or public sector, because that's what he was talking about when he talked about long-form podcasts, as though boring in-depth journalism were brand new, as though PBS hadn't been doing that for decades because they're separated from the profit motive. When you publicly fund these things, they can be isolated from those short-term incentives, those misguided incentives that lead to those races to the bottom. I think history bears this out. I think the policy research bears this out. I don't think it's a secret. I think there are democratic electoral remedies here. And I think we have a really, really good chance of making that happen. That's my spiel.
I just got to exercise my negativity bias here for a minute and point out that, all of that would perhaps work if we didn't have a Congress that was, in many cases, just as corrupt as this administration.
Right.
Now you can argue about, I don't know how you figure out how much corruption equals, can be compared from one group to another. But it seems pretty obvious that when it really comes down to it, the Congress has their hands in the pie in a way that makes their willingness to actually stand on behalf of the people. I mean, look at who supported the CARES Act, right? Mm-hmm. Pretty much freaking all of them. All of them.
Yeah, but so I think there is concrete evidence to say that this Congress, whatever it is, the 100 and something Congress, is better than the one before it. Just this week, we saw one of the greatest warmongers in Congress lose in a primary to a middle school principal who is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. Imagine that headline 6 years ago. that's impossible to imagine 6 years ago.
Right.
So I think that the will among elected officials for, just to start with something specific and trivial, campaign finance reform that is real and that will hold up in the courts, maybe in the form of a constitutional amendment in the extreme case, will for that is demonstrably increasing among elected officials. So it's not an all-at-once sort of thing. But I think that such blatant corruption as we have now, such a blatant attack on the public interest, is an opportunity for enacting the kind of reforms that we need to sort of slowly bend things in the right direction.
Well, I definitely think that campaign finance reform is elemental, and if there's any hope of salvaging this system, it's got to happen. I am perhaps less optimistic that we could ever get it to happen, because so much of what's happening in this world right now relies on politicians being bought and sold. Sure. That's basically the way, the sausage is made. The other thing that I would want to throw into the conversation at this point, and I realize that it's opening up a whole other can of worms, and that we probably should wrap it up relatively soon, just so that Andrew's able to do what he needs to do today. And maybe, we could kind of just think about this a little bit and do another segment at some point if you guys would like to. But the question that I've always wondered about, and which has been a theme on this show, is the degree to which we can think of human will as being an effective means of producing a desired outcome. So to what extent can we point to historical movements that have actually resulted in the thing that they intended to bring about? Of course, there are some cases where it does work for some period of time, but there's an awful lot that really just go horribly wrong. And so it's unclear to me that we can really rely on our own best efforts to bring about the world that we hope for. So that I think might be an interesting thing to bring into this conversation.
I think that is a whole other conversation, but it does make me think of this this question that we discussed earlier regarding Bin Laden and the timing, that issue of whether he, accomplished his goals or not. So was Will effective for him? But I'm just going to comment. I think, Noah, you're right that there are sins all around, but I think that it is wrong to say that there's necessarily an equivalence, or so just because we can't calculate how one type of imperfect, or to say the least, or corrupt act by a politician relates to others, that doesn't mean we can't have some clarity on what's going on and how it compares across the two sides. And I do think that it's easy to say, to look for things that each side did and say, hey, they both screwed up, they've both been bad, so they're equivalent in some sense, they're equally culpable, and so I think it's natural to do that to some extent, but I do think that there's a strong asymmetry that in terms of contributions to the problems we have now. I think that as Andrew referred to, there's evidence of one side being more sort of intentional and direct and wanting to take actions that are going to fail to serve the public interest because there's an ideological motivation, or they think that those failures will lead to some other success. But so then there's the question of if we have clear failures by one side, why is the electorate not recognizing that? And that's a big psychological issue that I'm kind of interested in, but we're not going to solve that one now.
That is a topic I would be very excited to talk about, Dan, with you later.
Put it on the list of future topics.
That will.
But I'll say no more. But I guess I kind of I didn't say it very succinctly here, but I do think there are two sides, and one sinned 100 times, and the other side A sinned 100 times, and side B sinned once, and there'll be some people who will look at the single sin from each side and say, look, they're both jerks, and no, 100 to 1 is, there's a big difference there. That, if you know what I mean.
Okay, well, I don't know what the ratio would be, of course, but it seems to me that if you just take a look at two of the biggest policy decisions made within the Congress and the role that both parties played, CARES Act is one of them, which probably is the biggest blow to working people in this country of pretty much any policy decision made. And there was virtually no resistance on the side of the Democrats. There was a couple of post-vote statements made by people like AOC that just really were kind of unsettling the extent to which that wasn't what she did with her vote. And it was after the vote that she makes the statement, which makes it look like she's just trying to repair the damage done within her constituency. And then there's the fact
Andrew, can I interrupt you actually just really quick? Andrew, do you have a take on that, by the way? Just a second response.
Short answer, no. Slightly longer answer is that I'll stick with no because I need to look this up, because she voted against it at a procedural stage and then voted for it in exchange for some token concessions. And I don't remember the details now, but yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Noah, did you? Sorry, I interrupted. Were you saying something?
Yeah, and the other example is the military budget. Democrats approved Trump's military budget. They talk a lot about how much they despise his foreign policy, but they approved his freaking military budget. I just don't see how, I don't see how much more hypocritical or corrupt you can get.
Yeah. I absolutely agree with that. No, that's it's disgusting, and I think that in a sense like that, you can say that every mean tweet that Trump has ever made is not as bad as voting for that military budget. But what I'm trying to figure out exactly how to articulate this. But
I want to point out one more thing, if you don't mind. I'm going to point out one more quick thing, which is that as terrible as Trump is, and I'm not going to argue that he's not as terrible as he is, and there's all kinds of details to it and what have you, so fine. Throw that into one big category. He hasn't started a new war yet. I'm not saying he won't, but he hasn't yet. There's a good chance that he will if he gets a second term, because that's what presidents do. But Obama, Obama destroyed Libya. Destroyed it. It's a completely dysfunctional state at this point. Open slave markets, people trying to get the hell out of there, refugees swarming through the whole area. That's on Obama. Big part of what was going on in Syria, what's been going on in Syria, is also on Obama. What else about Obama? Yemen, right? That was the Obama administration. And
I'm not.
And he continued the wars that he inherited, even though he said he wanted to stop them. So, it's like the partisan thing just doesn't add up to me. My way of looking at it is that it's really like third party or bust, basically, because it's pretty much one party. They have different styles.
I'm inclined to agree with that to a point. I'm not going here to defend Obama's foreign policy in any way, and I'm not here to make any sort of partisan point. But here's what I would say is, if you say a military budget comes before Congress, and let's say it's a unanimous vote in favor of it or something, what it might seem is like, oh, well, then that means there are 435 members of Congress that need to be persuaded or replaced. I don't think that's actually the case, because I think what you have is a lot of coordination and a lot of negotiation that happens prior to any actual voting. I think there is a great deal of evidence that talking about the Democratic Party monolithically in most of these issues is to miss what's going on. So the fact that the the runner-up in the presidential primary has been Bernie Sanders for 2 consecutive electoral cycles, tells us that there is, in a different foreign policy vision, in this different, genuine social democracy vision, that there is appetite for it, that is not if not the majority position within the party, then a substantial faction of it, which to me is a sign for great hope and optimism. I think the fact that someone like Eliot Engel is going to be leaving Congress now is a sign that new leadership is an opportunity for a recalibration of priorities among the rank and file. So while I agree with you completely in sharing your disgust for so many of these decisions, I think there is good reason to believe that a serious change is possible in the near future if there continues to be a groundswell of popular opposition to these policies, which I think is growing. And I think there is something to it. I think this week's elections are another sign of that. So I'm not here on behalf of any party. I don't want to defend the Democratic Party, but I think there are elements within it that are much worse than other elements and some that are better.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's true across the board, but the question is whether or not it, again, leads to tangible, meaningful improvement of the overall situation in an equitable way across the population. It seems to me that, this question of whether or not we're able to produce the results based upon our own will is really unavoidable at this point. There are practical considerations in the same way when we're talking about hitting the ground where certain powerful interests have their hands on the resource. In some respects, you could say the same thing has happened politically. And that political mechanism has its own kind of logic. So one of the questions that I would ask you would be, people had a lot of hope for AOC. And I'd say it's relatively fair to characterize her time in office as being pretty mixed right now. And there's a lot of people who are pretty disappointed with the way she's actually ended up behaving. And the question then becomes, is it the person or is it the system? Because there are a set of incentives within the political structure that create a certain type of person once you get there. So it's not really necessarily the person that needs to change as it is the political structure. And then we're faced with the same kind of problem, because it's fine to get certain people in, but if they aren't going to actually, the system has a way of weeding out the people who we need to be there,
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's a chicken or an egg problem,
Yeah,
you need the right people to change the system. You need the right people.
It's a really difficult circumstance, I think, to address effectively, because an awful lot of it is really just on the basis of hope. And I always thought it was ironic that was Obama's clarion call. It's like, hope, you can only live on hope for so long. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I think Bernie is basically the same thing. It's like, we see that there is the will for some kind of real change. In other words, there's a political base for it. But the guy who is at the center of it, who's the representative of it, has completely failed to stand up for his own frickin' campaign. And when the CARES Act came along, did Senator Sanders stand up? No. He's a guy who will say the right thing at this point, but in a way, he knows where his bread is buttered. He's a career politician. Mm-hmm. He understands that world. He voted for it. Mm-hmm. Bernie Sanders, the guy who... So it's I think that the problems here are way deeper, way more entrenched than we might think. I just don't know that the democratic mechanism is working anymore. And like I said before, the question is, where is the power? So as long as the people can be made to make the choice that the people who really have the power want, then it'll work. But if the people are going to make some kind of other choice, probably not, because they just don't have the power anymore. That's that would be my thesis, and I'd be happy to try to defend it next time. But I do realize that I want to give each of you guys an opportunity to say whatever the heck it is you want to say, and then I guess we better wrap it up. Otherwise, we will definitely go for another
last
40
word.
minutes.
I've got to run. Dan, take your last word.
I'm going to admit to being shamefully ignorant about foreign affairs now, and I guess that says I'm probably representative of a good chunk of the population and being pretty uninformed, and that's probably a big part of the problem, right? We don't have oversight, and that's why maybe there are some disasters happening that we're not aware of, and Trump hasn't started a war, but maybe he should be more involved if things are really going to hell in some of these places. I'm not very well informed about the Obama's policies there either, but of course, you can. I think it's possible that interventions, were justified at the time based on of information that was available then, and so on, and things might not have turned out as according to plan, and so on. But you raise some really good points there. But bottom line is, we're not paying attention, and that doesn't mean that the Trump administration is doing well in that regard, of course. But and what else? The CARES Act, why have politicians on both sides supported it? It's a good question. Why do they support the military? I mean, I think that one's easier to answer, which is that that's one institution that's still pretty broadly supported across the population. So the political incentives for all politicians to be broadly supportive are strong. I think that one's not so shocking, for better or for worse. Most people across the aisle are sort of broadly supported. So I'll stop there. So, yeah.
I'll just say one thing. I have no idea if it's possible to act collectively in a way that makes the world better for everybody. I don't know if human beings can do that, but we're all that we've got. So we still have to try.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I think the same way on that. I don't know. I think that fundamentally there's a heck of a lot more that we don't know, and that's fundamentally, I guess, a big element of what Dan was just saying, and it's just the truth for all of us across the board. There's only so much that we can understand. I think that to some extent what we might see as being a threat, where power is aggregated in these gigantic information systems that are overseen by AI, may potentially have some positive outcomes just because of that fact. So we might make, if my sense is that we are being forced into a situation where we're going to have to accept decision-making by agents that are not human. And as much as I hate that idea, and I really do hate that idea, it may produce a better result than what would happen otherwise. So that might be something else to throw into the mix. I also think that when you have a game that's gotten to the point where it's in essence, how would we put it, a predatory expression of sociopathy, which I think is one of the things that Schmattenberger said. It's not entirely clear that doing the thing that we would want is going to produce a good outcome. In other words, like, one of the concerns that I have about those of us who have been involved in the peace movement is that in the current state of the world, defunding the military may be a huge mistake. It gets back to this kind of pragmatic sense of things. Like, are we actually going to make the world better and our own lives better if we reallocate funding at a time when the rest of the world is getting increasingly militarized? The main thing that I was pointing out before was just what I see as being the hypocrisy from the office-holding Democrats. But as to what the actual policy is that would make sense given the circumstance that we're in, that's a separate conversation. So I'm sorry for the long-winded final remarks there. I really appreciate both of you guys coming on and talking about this stuff. There's a lot of complexity to it. I think that we have plenty more to talk about if you'd like to continue, and maybe we can share some notes with each other via email for a little while. And if you guys are interested in coming back, we'll schedule time to do so. But again, thanks so much for coming on and having this conversation.
All right, thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. It's great.
Thanks for listening. We look forward to serving you again soon. In the meantime, remember, turn that thing over a few times before you pick it up and take it home.